Hello and welcome to a new podcast by the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Gustaf Lansner and I'm here today with Hussein Askary to talk about his new book, Extending the New Silk Road to West Asia and Africa, or the second edition of this book. And you just returned from China, where you held presentations as part of a launch campaign of your book. And as I understand it, your book is about the Belt and Road Initiative and how it interfaces with West Asia, Middle East, West Asia, and Africa. And I'm just gonna give the word to you. I also want to mention there is a war going on, or there are several wars going on in the world today.
Yeah.
And you want to your idea is to bring to the table the idea that economic development can be a solution to this destabilization.
Yes. Thank you very much, Gustaf. I'm very happy to be with you. Yes, it's a very difficult one to sell these days, that we can have economic development and peace in West Asia or the Middle East, because many people are only thinking about military solutions and power politics. But if we look at the background why these things happen, we will find the reasons in economic and other, which have very little to do with military or political differences. I was in China 2 weeks, invited by 6 different universities to launch both the Chinese and English versions of the second edition of this report, which is published by the Schiller Institute. I'm a co-author. I'm the lead author, together with other colleagues in the Schiller Institute, Jason Ross and others. The first edition came out 2017, and the difference between this one and other books, that's why the Chinese are interested in finding out more about what I'm writing. I have written in Chinese media, been in interviews, but they want to get an assessment of what they are doing through the Belt and Road Initiative from a different perspective. Someone who lives in Europe, someone who is from Iraq, as I am originally, and who have studied these regions and Africa, and what is the impact of the Belt and Road in these regions. What this edition, we argue that what we presented there, which is not, what kind of projects or the catalog of projects to be built, although we name very key projects in this already 2017. But what we find now is that what we proposed then, both as the kind of projects that should be built, but also the method, how to go about financing them, and the kind of cooperation that should take place between China and these countries to accomplish these projects, has shown that we were right. However, for many reasons, it's not enough. Africa is 3 times larger than China, the population 1.3 billion people, and as we write in this new edition, Africa's population will grow to almost 3 billion by 2050, making it the largest young population in the world. People in Europe see this as a problem. The Chinese see this as an opportunity. And what I saw in China, visiting some of these China-Africa institutes, really amazed me and showed me that the Chinese are pushing this cooperation with China full steam. For example, in 2 of the institutes, one of them was in Changsha, where they have Chinese and African PhD graduates working together to create a total database, including every African country, almost every information you need about that country, what Chinese companies need to know about these countries, what Chinese politicians need to know about these countries. They're assembling all this information in a massive database, so they have a good understanding of every country in Africa. The other institute I visited, also, it was ironical because when I asked the students, it was a class of only Chinese students. And I asked them what they study. They said we study law and jurisdiction. And I said, well, what does that have to do with my book? Well, they said we are studying the laws of every African country. and legal systems of every country. There's tax systems in every African country. And these were young Chinese, 20, 22, 23, and they are going through all the legal systems of all the African countries, which shows me that they are serious about this. Of course, there are technical university I visited where students from global south countries learn how to build machines and deal with the robots and all kinds of machinery. So the Chinese are very serious about the question of development of the global south. Their orientation now is that you cannot continue to rely on the United States and Europe or the EU. You have to diversify your markets. You have to, at the same time, support your markets. And this is a very interesting philosophical outlook, is that they want Asia and Africa to become wealthier so they can have better partners, better customers, so to speak. And so generally what the book deals with is not simply all the projects. We deal with projects that are not built yet, but also the methodology, the scientific background, the scientific economic concept you need to master to be able to look at Africa as one total unit, economic unit, or West Asia, the Middle East, as one total unit, and then determine by also looking at every country and then all the countries collectively how you can go about developing all these regions and what is the benefit of that and why the Chinese model through the Belt and Road Initiative is the right one. So we emphasize these conceptual aspects of this to educate young economists, policymakers, and others on how to look at this whole question of economic development. And as you mentioned earlier, that this is also a recipe for peace and security.
All right. That's very interesting, but it's I think necessary also to bring up the criticisms. I mean, when we talk about this, it's of course I don't think either you or I believe this debt trap narrative, but we still have to to bring it up.
Sure.
Because critics will say that this is just a scheme or a tactic or strategy to colonize Africa in a different way. What do you say about that?
Yeah, well, I have one whole chapter on the debt trap narrative, why it's false, and how we can discover its fallacy, or if it's correct. There's a method to see that. But the general conclusion I have by studying many countries like Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Zambia, Kenya, Montenegro, is that it has nothing to do with China. Actually, Chinese loans to those countries are the correct way to do things because, for example, when you finance infrastructure, you have to have long-term credit loans by 20, 25 years long at an interest rate of 2 to 3%. Usually, it should be below the percentage of the growth of the economy per GDP. You cannot have credit loans and debt service, which is higher than your GDP growth, because that's where the debt trap comes from.
Yeah, and it takes time for infrastructure to pay off.
That's also the other issue, is that infrastructure is that you cannot make money immediately. The purpose of infrastructure is to increase the productivity of society by providing transport, power, water management, education, and healthcare. Without these, you cannot have a growing, productive economy. And the Chinese understand this from their homework. This is how China developed in 40 years into the world's leading industrial economy, but also lifting 800 million people out of poverty, but now moving into modernization. They say this is possible in Africa. As President Xi Jinping said already in 2015, you have to overcome 3 bottlenecks of development. The first bottleneck is the lack of credit, so-called money. The other bottleneck is the lack of infrastructure, and the third is the lack of skilled labor. And all these 3, China has been working hard with African countries to overcome. But as I said, Africa is too large for China alone to solve all these problems. African nations should do their part in financing internally, regionally, but also we have to mobilize Europe and the United States to contribute to the development of Africa, but also the Middle East, because this is crucial for our future survival economically and security-wise. So the debt trap narrative has been proven false. It's persistent because it keeps coming up the whole time. I'm writing a whole book about it right now during the summer. But the Chinese way of financing infrastructure is the right way. The reason we know that's the case is because of China's own development. But from the history of the United States, Europe, we know this was the method used to industrialize Europe and the United States. You have long-term credit to build infrastructure, because without the infrastructure, you cannot have industrialization. You don't build infrastructure to make money. Doesn't make money. It's a loser if you're out to make money. The private sector can build the infrastructure, but it should be centralized, financed by the state, as we had in Sweden. That's why Sweden is a modern industrial nation. We stopped doing that. That's why our infrastructure is in trouble. The United States did the same thing during the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt. Even before that, in the 19th century, many of the infrastructure projects were centralized, state-backed, although they are built by private, but they are state-backed, centralized projects. Space projects, they are all state-backed. Like even Elon Musk, he gets contracts from the state to sustain his operations. Because these things are not meant to make money, they are meant to increase the productivity of society in general through creation of new technologies and facilitating agricultural industrial production. So this is very, very simply put why the Chinese are not behind all these debt problems. What my research shows that it's actually Western loans, short-term, high-interest Western loans that put those countries in debt trap, because they use these short-term loans for solving trade deficit in times of crisis or fiscal deficit also in times of crisis. So you keep borrowing money at higher interest rates, shorter term, to pay old debt. So this is addiction.
Yeah.
This is the source of the debt trap of Sri Lanka, Zambia, Kenya, Pakistan, because they are in catch-22 the whole time. They need to borrow new money, pay old debt, but always at higher interest rate, shorter term. Chinese loans are 20, 25 years, have nothing to do with the issue.
And in your book, you don't only state these things as facts, but you actually present a method to find this out for yourself if you want to.
Yes, I've developed this methodology because I studied all these case studies and I found patterns that they repeat themselves, why these countries are in debt, what is China's share. So you have a 3-step method to determine if it's true this country is under debt trap by China. First, you look at the composition of the total debt of the country, who owns that debt. You always find China has only 10 to 15% of that country's debt. The rest is owed to Western institutions. Second is the quality of the debt. What is the loans used for? Are you borrowing money to buy drugs or pay old debt? Or are you borrowing money long-term to build infrastructure which enhances your ability to produce and pay back the loan? So it's a qualitative difference. The third is you look at every country, why they got into financial trouble. Was there civil war? Was there terrorism? What kind of resources they depend on? Sri Lanka, for example, got in trouble when there was terrorism, there was the tsunami, and there was the COVID. Their tourism sector collapsed. Their textile industries, which they depend on, also collapsed when the fuel for running the machinery went up. So you look at these factors, why these countries are in trouble, and then you find out that it has nothing to do with China. These have to do with international. When a country's currency is devalued by listening to the IMF conditionalities, their debt increases immediately because they need to produce more in national wealth to pay the foreign debt before the devaluation of their currency. All these countries went through a devaluation of their currency by more than 50% in 4 or 5 years, which made it impossible for them to pay their foreign debt with local resources. So these 3 things you look at, these are the parameters you investigate, and then you find the reality of why these countries are in trouble.
Okay, interesting. So, but what about the Middle East, or as you say, West Asia? Because we talked about Africa now, but and we also have West Asia and also the Iran
Yeah.
war.
Yeah, I mean, what I presented in China, which people thought was interesting, is a timeline which has led to this war, and what it has to do with the Belt and Road, but also the shift in the global economic power, which is driven by China's economic rise, by the global South, by the BRICS as a new economic power in the world, like BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Also adding other countries, BRICS plus, which are interestingly mostly in this region, so-called Middle East. Iran, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Ethiopia, even Saudi Arabia was included in the beginning, but because of pressure, it opted out. So the timeline goes like this because there are these stereotypes which I contradict in my study about the Gulf countries especially. Because the stereotype, the old model is that these countries have a small population but a lot of oil and gas, and they sell a lot of oil and gas. They get a lot of dollar, but they don't know what to do with it. They buy luxury cars, yachts, and then they invest the rest in weapons by the United States and Britain, and in financial markets and banks in the West, and real estate projects. And they are protected by the United States and Britain for their security. So this is where the money goes. But as I show that in the past 12 years, since 2014, the oil price collapsed for a protracted period below $60. For a long period, it was below $30. Like 2014, during the COVID, the oil price went below $30 per barrel. What these nations needed, $80 per barrel and above to stay afloat financially, to stay the rich Arabs.
Yeah.
But with that oil price collapse, for a long period, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Kuwait, all these countries said, we have to look for a new way out of this. We need to invest our resources to diversify. We need to have industry, petrochemical industry, chemical industries, focus on agriculture and infrastructure, logistics. And who was there to give the technology? It was China. So these nations started to industrialize more. But during this whole period, at the same time, we had regime change taking place in Libya, Syria, and of course, Afghan war was going on. Iraq was already regime changed. And we had these sets of crises in the region. But China went into this whole picture in 2022 with a very big summit meeting between China and Saudi Arabia and the Saudi capital. The next day was China and the Gulf countries leaders. And the third day was China and all Arab countries, all 22 Arab countries. And President Xi Jinping presented a massive menu, a list of areas where China and these countries can work together on financial resources, on buying oil and yuan, on building infrastructure, space exploration, nuclear power construction, AI, cloud computing, electronics industries, petrochemical, everything China has developed as technology, he offered that as a basis for cooperation with the Gulf and Arab countries. When we look at this whole region, we look at the totality. If you look at this region called the Middle East, and you draw a circle, this is the most interesting geographical location in the world. It's between 3 continents. It's between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. All trade between Asia, Europe goes through this area, which makes transport very cheap for those countries. 2, we have 2/3 of the hydrocarbons of the world, oil and gas, in this region, the reserves. 3, we have a very young, large population, over 500 million people with a relatively good education and enormous financial resources. The Gulf Cooperation Council sovereign wealth funds have about $6 to $8 trillion in their sovereign wealth funds and foreign reserve. This is the money Trump is talking about to take from them. But those countries already decided that this money will be used for development because they cannot live with just exporting oil. And China provided the way out for them by industrialization, by building logistics, and become integrated in the Belt and Road. The Gulf countries are Arab countries. On the other side of the Gulf, you have Iran, and the game has been to keep Iran and the Arab countries in tension, in conflict for many years. We had Iraq-Iran war. We have all the problems. So the Chinese, what they did is they bridged the gap between Iran and the Gulf countries, because the 2 months after December 22, what I mentioned, the summit between President Xi and the Arab countries, 2 months after that, in February, the Iranian president went to Beijing and signed a 25-year strategic comprehensive cooperation agreement, which is basically exchanging oil for technology and infrastructure and integrating Iran into the whole Belt and Road. 1 month after that, in March 2023, China managed to bring Saudi Arabia and Iran, these two very big powers, regional powers, to normalize diplomatic relations again, because the relations were broken since 2016, and there was all these proxy wars and Shia-Sunni conflict in Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, which these two countries were involved in against each other. Now suddenly the Chinese say, look, you can unite and prosper rather than being divided and conquered. And the same year, the BRIX Plus was expanded. And also it was the same year where the United States launched and the EU launched the India, Middle East, EU corridor, which is a purely geopolitical project. It has nothing to do with building infrastructure. It's just to divide the countries into friends and foes. 1 month after that announcement, in September, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, made his big speech in the United Nations General Assembly, where he showed the famous map of the heroes and the villains, the good guys and the bad guys, and this region was completely divided between friends of Israel and enemies of Israel and the West. And then, interestingly, the map of Israel did not include Palestine. Palestine was completely erased. 1 week after that, Hamas attacked Israel and say, we are still on the map. You cannot erase the Palestinian people or the Palestinian issue. And when we have this snowballing of violence, genocidal war, and then the escalation towards the Iran war, all these things happened within that context, that there is a new world order which is emerging and incorporating the countries in this region, which has been the cockpit of global geopolitics, with war and destruction, permanent wars. And now suddenly China comes in and say, well, this is a stupid way of doing things. We should work together, build your economies, use your resources for something good. And we are willing to work with you. And we have the whole global South and the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization willing to work with you to stabilize this region, bring peace through economic development. And this is what upset a lot of people in the United States and in Europe and Britain, because their ideology is that the world is a jungle, it's a zero-sum game. If China wins, we lose. The Chinese say, no, everybody wins if you work this way. It's good for Europe, it's good for the United States to have peace and economic development in these regions. And this is where we agree with China on this, and we have a long history of research that this is the right way to do things. You cannot have peace without economic development. So this is basically the idea, and I think we have war because of that.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Okay, are there any more aspects of your book that you want to take up?
Well, there are things that we try to also explain for people is that, for example, in Europe, we have this big debate about immigration. And our view is that the method is wrong of looking at this question. Because the reason people immigrate from Africa and also from the Middle East is because life has turned into a nightmare there. And if you want to stop immigration, you don't sink immigrant boats in the sea or stop them at the border. What you should do instead, find what are the causes of this and deal with them. As I said, the regime change wars have contributed greatly to the mass immigration to Europe, even from Africa, with the destruction of Libya and the emergence of Boko Haram and all these terrorist groups and in the Sahel region. The other problem is economic development. Even the Pope recently was asked about the immigration debate in Europe. He said, well, we have to look at it the other way around. What is Europe doing to develop the global South and Africa to make sure that people stay in their countries and have a good life? And this is what our book actually deals with. We explain why it's great for Europe to industrialize Africa and the Middle East. Because we have enormous potential still, but our economies are declining, our companies are out of business, and we need a renaissance. This is what the title of the book is. And we need an economic renaissance in the Middle East and in Africa so that European countries, European economies, European know-how and technology finds a way of benefiting society here too. And this is the natural way of stopping this immigration. So this is one of the issues we deal with, and we think that Europe economically, physically should be integrated with Africa. I mean, I told you the Chinese look at Africa, 3 billion young people, enormous natural resources. This is a huge market. You can't ignore that.
Huge potential.
Huge potential. And you can imagine how much is needed to develop that market. And how much benefit you can reap from that. It's not like you are manipulating the Africans. The Africans want that development, but they have been prevented. They have been prevented from getting the technology. They have been told that they are inferior, that they are corrupt, and they will never develop. That's why they are poor. It's not true, because they have been prevented from development. We have the colonial period, we have the neo-colonial period, and we have all these policies which prevent technology transfer to those nations, including nuclear power. And China and Russia now are offering these countries these technologies. But as we say, it's not enough, because Africa and the Middle East are very big. You need to do a lot. So even when it comes to the question of the Palestinian-Israeli-Arab conflict, we have the Oasis Plan. We believe that there should be a two-state solution. We have a big ideological problem in Israel now, and the so-called Zionist lobby and so on. But for Israel to survive into the future in this environment, they need to find a way of coexisting with the Arab nations and making sure that the Palestinians are giving their due rights. But we don't think political agreements are enough. And therefore, for a long time, the Schiller Institute has been advocating this idea of the Oasis Plan, where you bring economic development, especially solving the water issue in Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Syria, because water is more problematic than oil and gas in this region. And this is one of the big reasons of many conflicts. I mean, the Israelis tried to take rivers in the Golan Heights, water resources in southern Lebanon. In the West Bank, there's a lot of groundwater. They also want to take over, and so on and so forth. So developing the water resources through desalination, building canals from the Dead Sea from the Red Sea and Mediterranean to the Dead Sea, using the different alleviation to generate power. These are not navigation canals, as some people think. These are water aqueducts. And then you build small modular nuclear power plants to generate power, but also desalinate seawater, grow food, and control the desert, and industrialize this region. Because you want to use the oil and gas in this region not to burn it, but to use it for industrial purposes and raise the added value of these goods. So peace through development should become the main idea. And there are enough resources, there's enough land for everyone. It just we get rid of this zero-sum game and this fight over limited resources, which is a weird idea given that with scientific technological progress, we can solve these problems.
Okay. Thank you so much. Maybe we'll do more of these.
Yeah, definitely. There are many issues. It pertains because we are walking into this area of, what philosophy do you have? What kind of culture do you have? Which is reflected in your policies. If you think the world is a jungle or you think the world is a garden, it comes from your cultural and philosophical understanding of the world. So these issues must be integrated because the Belt and Road Initiative and the Silk Road, ancient Silk Road, were also vehicles for cultural exchange, idea exchange, not simply trade and technology and goods. So this is very, very important, and I hope we will have time to discuss these things.
Yeah.
And you and Stephen also have done a lot of work on looking back in history with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the German philosopher, and how he saw the relationship to China and Chinese philosophy. This is very, very important today.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, thank you for today.
Thank you very much.